The summer sun beat down on the pool party, but all I could feel was the cold, hard press of a police officer's gun against my temple. What started as a carefree Saturday instantly became a fight for my life against a man sworn to protect. The sun felt like a promise that day. One of those perfect late July Saturdays where the heat is heavy but a light breeze skims across your skin just when you need it. My best friend Jasmine had practically dragged me out of my apartment for her cousin's annual pool party. I'm a pediatric nurse, and after a long week of sick kids and worried parents, my idea of a perfect weekend was my couch, a book, and blissful silence. But Jasmine can be persuasive. "Bree, you need to see the sun," she'd said. "You're starting to look translucent. Come on, there's barbecue, and you know Marcus is going to be there." So there I was, sitting on the edge of a plastic lounge chair, a lukewarm plastic cup in my hand, actually having a good time. The party was in a nice, quiet subdivision, the kind with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. Kids were splashing in the shallow end of the community pool. The smell of chlorine and grilled chicken hung in the air, and the music was a perfect blend of 90s R&B and current hits. It wasn't deafening, just a solid feel-good vibe. I was laughing at a story Jasmine was telling, feeling the tension from the week finally melt away from my shoulders. It was peaceful. It was normal. And that's what makes what happened next so insane. The first sign of trouble was a man who appeared at the gate to the pool area. He was probably in his late 40s, with a severe crew cut, a face flushed red with anger, and a physique that screamed off-duty cop. He wore a tight gray t-shirt and cargo shorts, and he didn't walk, he stomped. He pointed a thick finger at the portable speaker sitting on a picnic table. "You people need to turn that racket down. This is a respectable neighborhood." Jasmine's cousin, David, who was hosting the party, immediately went over to him, hands up in a placating gesture. "Hey man, no problem. Sorry if it was bothering you. We'll turn it down." David was the most easygoing person I knew. He wasn't looking for a fight. He just wanted everyone to have a good time. The man grunted, gave us all one last withering glare, and stomped back across the street to his house, which had a perfect view of the entire pool area. David turned the music down a few notches. It was still audible, but barely more than background noise. The vibe was slightly dampened, but within a few minutes, the laughter and conversation picked back up. We figured that was the end of it. We were wrong. About an hour later, he was back. This time he looked even angrier, and I could smell the sickly sweet scent of cheap gin on his breath even from a few feet away. He stormed right past the gate, which someone had left propped open, and marched straight to the speaker. "I thought I told you to turn it off," he roared, his voice thick and slurring slightly. "Sir, we turned it way down," David said, stepping in front of him. "It's the middle of the afternoon on a Saturday. We're not doing anything wrong." The man got right in David's face. "You people think you can just come in here and do whatever you want. This isn't your neighborhood." The racial undertone was so thick you could choke on it. Most of the party guests were black. The man was white. Suddenly, the air grew cold despite the summer heat. A few of the bigger guys at the party stood up and started walking toward them, not aggressively, but just to make their presence known. I felt a knot of pure ice form in my stomach. I've seen situations like this escalate before. I just wanted to grab Jasmine and leave. "Look," I said, my voice shaking a little as I stood up. I tried to keep my tone calm and professional, the same one I use on panicked parents. "Sir, we don't want any trouble. We're celebrating a birthday. Why don't you just go back home and we'll be sure to keep it down?" He turned his furious, bloodshot eyes on me. For a second, I thought he was going to say something or maybe even shove me. Instead, a twisted, ugly smile spread across his face. He didn't say a word. He just turned around and stomped back towards his house. A collective sigh of relief went through the party. "What a psycho," someone muttered. David looked shaken. "Maybe we should just pack it up," he said. But before we could even start gathering our things, the man was coming back. He moved with a terrifying purpose this time. The gate was closed, but he slammed it open with his shoulder. and in his right hand, glinting in the bright afternoon sun, was a gun. Panic erupted. People screamed. Parents grabbed their kids and scrambled for the exit on the other side of the pool. The music was still playing softly, a cruel, upbeat soundtrack to our terror. He wasn't just holding the gun, he was brandishing it, waving it around like a maniac. He shoved David's uncle, a man in his 60s, to the ground. He kicked over a cooler, sending ice and drinks skittering across the concrete. His eyes scanned the chaos, searching. My blood ran cold when they landed on me. He started walking directly toward me. My feet felt like they were cemented to the ground. Jasmine was screaming my name, trying to pull me away, but I was frozen. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, his face a mask of pure rage and entitlement. He smelled of sweat and gin and something else, something rotten. He grabbed the front of my swimsuit cover-up with his free hand, yanking me forward so my face was inches from his. He was snarling, spitting as he spoke. "You think you can talk to me like that? You think you can tell me what to do in my own neighborhood?" And that's when I felt the cold, hard press of metal against my temple. The world went silent, the screams and the music fading into a dull roar in my ears. All I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart and the horrifyingly soft click of the gun's safety being disengaged. Time didn't just slow down, it fractured. Each second stretched into an eternity filled with a universe of terrifying possibilities. I could feel the cold circle of the muzzle pressing into my skin, a brand of pure terror. I could smell the gin on his breath, a sour cloud mixed with the scent of his sweat. I could see the tiny, broken blood vessels in his eyes, the feral glint of a man who had completely lost control and was enjoying it. My mind, which should have been racing, was eerily calm, a silent observer cataloging the details of my own potential murder. A single thought echoed in the emptiness. This is it. This is how I die, at a pool party. "I'm a police officer," he snarled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through my skull. The words were meant to be an assertion of authority, but they sounded like a confession of madness. "You show me respect, all of you." He wrenched my head to the side with the gun, forcing me to look at the terrified faces of my friends. Jasmine was sobbing, her hands over her mouth. David stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The children had been rushed away, but the remaining adults were trapped, paralyzed by the sight of the weapon. Then a voice cut through the haze. "Hey, let her go." It was Marcus. He had been on the other side of the pool talking to one of his cousins when the chaos erupted. Now he stood about 10 feet away, his hands held up, palms open and empty. He was a tall guy, built like a linebacker, but his posture wasn't threatening. It was the opposite. He was making himself as non-threatening as possible, a slow-motion surrender. The cop's head snapped towards him. The gun, however, stayed pressed firmly against my temple. "And who the hell are you?" he spat. "My name is Marcus. I'm nobody," he said, his voice impossibly steady. "Look, sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were just having a party. We'll pack up right now. We'll leave. Just please let the lady go." The cop laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "A misunderstanding? I'll tell you the misunderstanding. It's you people thinking you belong here, thinking you can make all the noise you want, thinking you can disrespect a man in his own neighborhood." He shoved the gun harder against my head, and I let out a small, involuntary whimper. A tear I didn't know was there finally broke free and traced a hot path down my cheek. "Okay, you're right," Marcus said, taking a half-step closer. "You're absolutely right. We're sorry. We made a mistake. Just tell us what you want us to do." He was playing a dangerous game, trying to placate a rabid dog. But what other choice did we have? The cop's eyes narrowed, shifting his focus from me to Marcus. He saw a new target, a new challenge to his authority. He ripped his hand from my cover-up and shoved me so hard I stumbled backwards, tripping over a discarded pool noodle and landing painfully on the hot concrete. For a split second, I was free, but the relief was instantly replaced by a fresh wave of terror as he turned and aimed the gun, with both hands now, directly at Marcus's chest. "What I want," the cop said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, "is for you to get on your knees." Marcus didn't hesitate. He slowly lowered himself to the ground, his eyes never leaving the cop's. The rest of us could only watch, trapped in a nightmare unfolding under the bright, indifferent sun. It was in that moment of horrifying silence, with Marcus on his knees and a gun pointed at his heart, that we heard it. Faint at first, then rapidly growing louder, the unmistakable wail of police sirens. Hope surged through me, so powerful it almost made me sick. They were coming. Help was coming. But as the sirens grew to a deafening shriek, I saw the look on the cop's face change. The drunken rage was replaced by something colder, more calculating, a cornered animal's cunning. Two squad cars screeched to a halt outside the gate, and officers burst into the pool area, guns drawn, shouting commands. "Police! Drop the weapon! Get on the ground!" The scene was pure chaos. But the off-duty cop, the man holding my friends and me hostage, didn't drop his gun. Instead, he did something that chilled me to the bone. He took a small step back, lowering his own weapon just slightly, and screamed at the arriving officers, his voice filled with a desperate, convincing panic. "He's got a gun! The one on his knees! He's got a gun!" The world shattered into a kaleidoscope of confusion and terror. For a horrifying split second, the arriving officers' guns, which had been aimed at the aggressor, wavered. Their eyes flickered between the man screaming at them, a man who looked like one of them, who spoke their language of authority and threat, and Marcus, a large black man on his knees with his hands in the air. It was the ultimate nightmare scenario, the racial calculus of a police encounter playing out in real time, weaponized by the very man who was supposed to uphold the law. "He doesn't have a gun!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. The rough concrete scraped my knees, but I didn't feel it. "He's lying. That man is the one with the gun. He put it to my head." My voice was raw, shredded by panic, but it was enough. It broke the spell. One of the officers, a woman with a stern face and clear eyes, refocused on the off-duty cop. "Sir, I'm going to say this one more time," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. "Drop your weapon now." The man, I later learned his name was Sergeant Andrew Miller, seemed to deflate. The bravado, the rage, the calculated lie, it all evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, drunk, middle-aged man holding a gun he no longer knew what to do with. He looked at the officers, at Marcus still on his knees, at my face, streaked with tears and fury. He saw the witnesses, the cell phones that had inevitably come out and were recording every second of his career-ending, life-altering meltdown. The gun clattered to the concrete. The moment it fell, the officers moved in with swift, practiced efficiency. Miller was on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back before he could even register what was happening. As they hauled him to his feet, he started yelling again, a torrent of slurred excuses and accusations. "She came at me. They were threatening me. It's my neighborhood. I'm a cop. I'm one of you." They ignored him, shoving him toward the gate. Other officers were securing the scene, their initial aggression softening into procedural calm. An EMT was checking on David's uncle, who was shaken but unhurt. Another officer was speaking to a still kneeling Marcus, gently telling him he could stand up. Marcus rose slowly, his whole body trembling with adrenaline. I ran to him, and we just held each other for a long moment, the shared terror creating an instant, unbreakable bond.
Then I went to Jasmine, who was still crying, and held her too. We were all alive. We were safe. The immediate danger had passed. But as the flashing blue and red lights painted the scene in surreal, pulsing colors, I knew this was far from over. The next few hours were a blur of witness statements, flashing cameras, and the careful, impersonal questions of detectives. We told our stories over and over. How Miller had come over, how he was drunk and aggressive, how he had escalated the situation from a noise complaint to a hostage situation. We were lucky. There were more than a dozen of us, all telling the same story. And there was video. At least 3 different people had started recording when Miller came back with the gun. The footage was shaky, filled with screams, but it was undeniable. It showed him putting the gun to my head. It showed him aiming it at Marcus. It showed him lying to the other officers. It was a prosecutor's dream. I went home that night, but I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the cold press of the gun against my temple. I heard the click of the safety. I saw the look of pure, unadulterated hatred in Andrew Miller's eyes. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a man with a badge, a man entrusted to protect and serve, who saw a group of black people enjoying a Saturday afternoon and decided they were a threat that needed to be neutralized. He didn't see a party, he saw an invasion. He didn't hear music, he heard a challenge. And when I, a black woman, spoke to him with a calm voice, he didn't see a peacemaker, he saw an uppity target who needed to be put in her place. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Miller was immediately suspended, and the story exploded. Local news, national news, it was everywhere. I became the woman held at gunpoint by a cop at a pool party. My face was on TV, my voice on the radio. The police union released a statement about Miller being a decorated officer and urged the public to let the justice system do its work. It was disgusting. His lawyer started floating a narrative that Miller suffered from PTSD and was intimidated by the large crowd. They were trying to paint him as the victim. I refused to let that happen. I had to testify at the preliminary hearing, walking into a sterile courtroom and seeing him sitting there at the defendant's table, dressed in a suit, looking sober and utterly pathetic. He wouldn't look at me. I sat on the witness stand, the prosecutor asking me to recount every terrifying detail. I described the smell of gin on his breath, the weight of the gun against my skull, the way he sneered the words, "you people." I spoke clearly and calmly, my nurse's training kicking in, allowing me to detach just enough to get through it without breaking down. I looked at the judge, at the court reporter, at the jurors, and I made damn sure they saw me. They saw a woman, a professional, a person who was just trying to enjoy a day off when a man with a badge decided her life was his to threaten. The gun clattered to the concrete. The moment it fell, the officers moved in with swift, practiced efficiency. Miller was on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back before he could even register what was happening. As they hauled him to his feet, he started yelling again, a torrent of slurred excuses and accusations. "She came at me. They were threatening me. It's my neighborhood. I'm a cop. I'm one of you." They ignored him, shoving him toward the gate. Other officers were securing the scene, their initial aggression softening into procedural calm. An EMT was checking on David's uncle, who was shaken but unhurt. Another officer was speaking to a still kneeling Marcus, gently telling him he could stand up. Marcus rose slowly, his whole body trembling with adrenaline. I ran to him, and we just held each other for a long moment, the shared terror creating an instant, unbreakable bond. Then I went to Jasmine, who was still crying, and held her too. We were all alive. We were safe. The immediate danger had passed. But as the flashing blue and red lights painted the scene in surreal, pulsing colors, I knew this was far from over. The next few hours were a blur of witness statements, flashing cameras, and the careful, impersonal questions of detectives. We told our stories over and over. How Miller had come over, how he was drunk and aggressive, how he had escalated the situation from a noise complaint to a hostage situation. We were lucky. There were more than a dozen of us, all telling the same story. And there was video. At least 3 different people had started recording when Miller came back with the gun. The footage was shaky, filled with screams, but it was undeniable. It showed him putting the gun to my head. It showed him aiming it at Marcus. It showed him lying to the other officers. It was a prosecutor's dream. I went home that night, but I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the cold press of the gun against my temple. I heard the click of the safety. I saw the look of pure, unadulterated hatred in Andrew Miller's eyes. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a man with a badge, a man entrusted to protect and serve, who saw a group of black people enjoying a Saturday afternoon and decided they were a threat that needed to be neutralized. He didn't see a party, he saw an invasion. He didn't hear music, he heard a challenge. And when I, a black woman, spoke to him with a calm voice, he didn't see a peacemaker. He saw an uppity target who needed to be put in her place.
The day the verdict was scheduled to be read, the courtroom was packed. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might break free. Jasmine held one of my hands, Marcus the other. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable, stoic masks of civic duty. Andrew Miller sat at his table, staring straight ahead. The foreman, a thin man with glasses, stood and cleared his throat. He unfolded a piece of paper. The entire room held its breath. On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, the foreman began, his voice flat and emotionless. We, the jury, find the defendant. He paused, and in that single agonizing beat of silence, my entire world tilted on its axis. He looked up, his eyes briefly meeting mine before flicking away. Not guilty. The words "not guilty" didn't register at first. They were just sounds, empty of meaning, hanging in the dead air of the courtroom. It was like my brain refused to process them. Not guilty? How could he be not guilty? There were a dozen witnesses. There was a video, a crystal clear, horrifying video of him pressing a gun to my head. The room erupted. A strangled sob escaped Jasmine's lips. Marcus's hand tightened on mine, his knuckles white. On the other side of the room, Miller's family let out quiet cries of relief. Miller himself dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking in what I could only assume was a grotesque performance of relief. A wave of nausea washed over me, hot and sickening. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Not guilty. The jury had watched that video. They had heard my testimony. They had seen the terror in my eyes, and they had decided that a man pointing a loaded gun at an unarmed woman's head was not aggravated assault. They had bought the defense's narrative. The decorated officer, the PTSD, the intimidating crowd of black people just trying to have a barbecue. He was one of them, and we were not. The system I had been told to trust, the justice I had been promised, was a lie. The prosecutor looked shell-shocked. He came over to us, stammering apologies, his face pale. I couldn't even look at him. I just stood up, my body feeling strangely light and disconnected, and walked out of the courtroom. I didn't run. I walked with a deliberate, cold calm I didn't know I possessed. I pushed through the throng of reporters, ignoring their shouted questions, and didn't stop until I was outside, the gray city sky pressing down on me. I didn't cry. I was too empty for tears. The rage was a block of ice in my chest, too solid and too deep to melt. In the days that followed, the verdict was all anyone talked about. There were protests, editorials, talking heads on cable news debating the decision. For many, it was just another headline, another example of a broken system. But for me, it was my life. Andrew Miller was a free man. He had faced no consequences. He still lived in that same house, across from that same pool. He had terrorized a group of innocent people, threatened my life, and walked away scot-free.
The thought of him going on with his life, maybe even getting his job back eventually, was a poison that seeped into every corner of my mind. But as the initial shock wore off, the ice in my chest began to thaw, and the rage started to burn. I wasn't going to let this be the end of the story. If the criminal justice system wouldn't hold him accountable, I would find another way. I wasn't a lawyer or an activist. I was a nurse. I cared for people. And I realized that the story, my story, was the most powerful weapon I had. I called the prosecutor and asked for the contact information of the U.S. Attorney's Office. I spent nights researching federal civil rights laws. I learned that what Miller did wasn't just assault, it was a hate crime. It was an act of terror meant to intimidate us because of our race. I contacted the NAACP. I reached out to civil rights attorneys. Marcus, Jasmine, David, and every single adult who was at that party stood with me. We would not be silent. We filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Andrew Miller. This wasn't about money. It was about the truth. The burden of proof was different. The legal questions were different. This wasn't just about a gun. It was about his intent. It was about why he targeted us. The Department of Justice, spurred by the public outcry and our relentless pressure, also opened its own investigation into Miller for deprivation of rights under color of law. The legal battle was long and exhausting. It took another year of my life. Miller's lawyers tried to get the case dismissed, claiming double jeopardy, but they failed. This was a different crime. His defense tried the same tactics, painting him as a troubled veteran and us as an unruly mob. But this time, in federal court, the narrative didn't stick. Our lawyer was brilliant. She systematically dismantled their story, using Miller's own words, "you people," "your neighborhood," to show his clear racial animus. She presented the video not just as evidence of an assault, but as evidence of a hate crime in progress. This time, when the verdict came, I was ready for anything. I had fortified myself against disappointment, but when the jury foreman stood up, there was a different energy in the room. He looked directly at me, his expression resolute. On the charge of violating the plaintiff's civil rights, he said, his voice ringing with clarity, "We find for the plaintiff." A collective gasp, then an explosion of joyful, tearful celebration erupted from our side of the courtroom. I finally broke. The tears I had held back for more than a year came in a hot, cleansing flood. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a validation of my truth, of my humanity. Miller was found liable, but the best was yet to come. 2 months later, Andrew Miller was sentenced in the federal criminal case. The judge, an older black woman with eyes that had seen everything, looked down at him from the bench. She spoke of his betrayal of his oath, of the terror he inflicted on innocent children and families, of how he used his position of authority not to protect, but to menace and intimidate. She sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison. 10 years. I saw him one last time as the marshals led him away in handcuffs, his face pale and slack with shock. He was no longer the raging monster from the pool or the smug defendant in a suit. He was just a small, broken man who had let his hatred consume him and was finally, blessedly facing the consequences. Walking out of that federal courthouse, I felt the sun on my face. It was no longer a promise. It was a fact. Justice is a long, winding, and often painful road. But that day, we had finally reached the destination.